Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In the final section of this course, we're going to be examining World War II and the 1940s. But before we get there, we need to look back one last time on the 1920s and 30s, and specifically the diplomacy of that era, because it's in those years that we can find the roots of the conflict that erupts as World War II. So in this first series of lectures, we're going to look more closely at the diplomacy of the 1920s, starting with this lecture on the aspect of disarmament. First, let's take a look back on the 1920s in terms of presidential leadership. Now, much of this we covered earlier in the semester, but we all might need a quick refresher just to discuss who was in charge at that time. Recall that at the end of the 19-teens, Woodrow Wilson had gone out on the campaign trail in support of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Recall also that he suffered from a stroke while out on that speaking tour, which nearly killed him and incapacitated him for a time. It also might be a little surprising to know that as of the late 19-teens, the old firebrand Teddy Roosevelt was contemplating a run for the presidency in 1920. Roosevelt had lived a very active life and perhaps cheated death a number of times along the way. In one famous instance, he was walking up the steps to the stage to make a speech when an assassin from just a few feet away fired a bullet straight into his chest. As fate would have it, the bullet plunged through a speech of some 35 pages long that Roosevelt had folded over a couple times in his breast pocket. So he was saved by his own speech and actually proceeded to give the entire speech, only going to the hospital after it was done. But Roosevelt could cheat death only so long. While he was thinking about a run for the presidency in 1920, he was suffering from the after effects of a nightmarish trip down the Amazon River in 1913 and 14. It was a miracle he survived the trip at all. But for the remainder of his life, he suffered from recurring infections. And one of those infections finally killed him not long after the new year of 1919. And so Teddy Roosevelt was removed from the scene. With Wilson in poor health and his popularity waning, and with Roosevelt's unfortunate passing, there was no clear candidate and no strong leader to lead us through the 1920s. And so the presidency of the 1920s fell to Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Harding, you might remember, was generally well-liked and popular across the nation, but also remember his presidency was one of the most scandal-ridden in all of American history. He, unfortunately, surrounded himself by a hopelessly corrupt gang of his friends from Ohio, at one point saying, "My friends, the SOBs, I can't trust any of them. Isn't there anyone I can trust?" And remember as well that Harding himself fell ill after a 1923 cruise to Alaska and died while still in office. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, again not a terrible president, but not terribly remarkable either, known as Silent Cal, and the jokes about his silence abounded. Here's a small sampling. He could be silent in 5 languages. When he died, how did you know? And the famous writer H.L. Mencken, who said, "Like being at a banquet with all the imaginable delicacies there, and you satisfy yourself by eating flies in the corner." And then, of course, there was Herbert Hoover. With his popular and successful career prior to the presidency, taking office on the campaign of ridding the nation of poverty altogether, and then living with the unfortunate legacy of being saddled with the Great Depression. So what does all of this mean? In essence, during the 1920s, the nation was governed by a series of unremarkable and mediocre presidents, after not long having gone through the legacies of towering figures like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And so in the 1920s, some scholars have noted the nation ran more like a rudderless ship with little direction from bold and powerful men. And the same might be said in some ways of American diplomacy in this period. Perhaps coincidentally, though, those same weak presidents managed to appoint some pretty successful secretaries of state, including Charles Evans Hughes and Henry Stimson, whose accomplishments and legacies we're going to be discussing shortly. The first major diplomatic thread that we need to talk about in this era is disarmament. It was under Charles Evans Hughes in the early 1920s that the United States, along with the rest of the world, embarked on a mission to disarm. It seemed reasonable in the aftermath of World War I to surmise that at least part of the blame for the war lay with an accumulation of weapons in Europe and the rest of the world. So as we came out of World War I, it was widely believed that we needed to reduce the number of weapons and arms to prevent another war from happening. The United States also relied on its economic superiority to maintain peace. The United States, by the late 1920s, produced manufactured goods larger than the other 6 major powers: Great Britain, Germany, France, the Soviet Union, Italy, and Japan combined. The main vehicle for this disarmament was a series of conferences in the 1920s and 30s, beginning with the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 22. The conference reflected the new balance of power in the world after World War I. While Great Britain was still right near the top, now the United States too was at the top, and not far behind, at least as a naval power, was Japan. In November 1921, Hughes announced the Washington Naval Conference in Washington, D.C. The conference focused on naval interest in the Pacific and Asia, and those powers with interest in that area were invited to the conference: the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, Italy, China, Belgium, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Each of the major powers at this conference had its own goals and interests. For the United States, one of the major ones was to preserve the open door in China, which allowed equal access to the United States and other powers. They also hoped to inhibit Japan's influence and power, particularly in the Pacific Ocean, and limit their ability to spread across the ocean. For Great Britain, its major aim was to maintain its status in the world as a great power, which seemed in the aftermath of World War I to be slipping at least just a bit. And one of the ways they might do that was to avoid an arms race that other nations would surely capitalize on. And for Japan, it sought to preserve its sphere of influence in the Pacific, and also to convey the image of not being an aggressive, expansionist power at that time. It's easy to look back and view this conference through the context of what would come in World War II, when Japan was, in fact, an aggressive power and a very powerful enemy in that part of the world. But that wasn't really the case in the early 1920s. While there might have been hints of things to come, Japan was not yet a great power, and it sought through this conference in part to hold the other powers in check, at least somewhat, while it was on its way to becoming a great power. So with those motivations in mind, the conference produced a series of treaties, including the Four-Power Treaty between the United States, Britain, Japan, and France, the 4 greatest powers at that conference. The 4 agreed to maintain the status quo in the Pacific, to respect each other's positions at that time, and to discuss and confer about any violations that might occur. The Five-Power Treaty is considered the most important to come out of this conference. It's the same as the Four-Power Treaty, but adding Italy. And the Five-Power Treaty was most important for limiting the production of large ships. It didn't include or mention smaller ships, which we're going to talk about later, but on capital ships of more than 10,000 tons. It imposed a 10-year moratorium on the building of any more such ships. It also fixed a ratio of the tonnage of such ships allowed among the five powers. The ratio was for the England and the United States 5, for Japan 3, and for Italy and France 1.75. And finally, the British and United States agreed not to build any new bases in the Pacific, thus preserving Japan's area of influence. A final treaty, the Nine-Power Treaty, was agreed to by all 9 of the participating nations. And it essentially reaffirmed the open door in China, that they would all respect access to China of all of the other powers. The Washington Naval Conference was significant. Not only did it serve to decrease arms, it also signaled a new balance of power in the world and launched a new mechanism for maintaining peace in the world, disarmament. At the same time, it had weaknesses. It was limited to capital ships, those largest ships, and an arms race to build submarines and smaller ships soon followed. It also made no attempt to limit planes, bombs, guns, or other weapons, which nations, particularly Germany prior to World War II, would soon begin to accumulate. The United States actually took advantage of the Washington Naval Conference to upgrade and retool the Navy. It scrapped old and obsolete ships, as did some other nations, and you see some pictures of that here on the screen. With the moratorium on building new ships, it upgraded the ships it had, replacing engines and other equipment, re-outfitting them with newer guns and weapons, and so on. There were other conferences over the next 2 decades, most of which were not as noteworthy or successful as the Washington Naval Conference. There were conferences in Geneva in 1927 and 32, and in London in 1935, which actually ended when at least one of the parties walked out, and nothing really substantial came out of them. The one other noteworthy conference of this era is the London Naval Conference of 1930, and the major nations made some effort to address some of the flaws of the Washington Naval Conference, particularly that it included smaller ships and submarines as well. So out of the London Naval Conference, the United States and Great Britain would have an equal ratio of all ships, not just capital ships. Japan would be equal to the United States and Great Britain on submarines and closer on smaller ships. But it also extended the moratorium on building capital ships until 1936. Now, as a final note, it's a mistake to look back and view the agreements reached in these conferences through the lens of World War II, which we know, with the benefit of hindsight, is coming, but that people at that time didn't know was coming. So it's important to remember that Japan, when it agreed to these limitations, was not the great power that it would become. We're going to talk a little bit more in a future lecture about assessing the diplomacy of the 20s in broader terms.